The day she called me old and useless, she said it like she was describing the weather. Flat, casual, almost bored. Honestly, she said, crossing her arms in the kitchen doorway, I don't even know why you still try to involve yourself in things. You're old and useless. For a moment, the room was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your chest. My son stood beside her, staring down at the floor like he had suddenly developed a deep interest in the tiles. And I stood there, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. Old. Useless. 2 words. Strange how 2 words can erase 40 years of work in someone else's eyes. But the truth is, that moment didn't start the story. It only revealed it. Because families rarely break in a single moment. They crack slowly. Hairline fractures that deepen over time, until one day you realize the house you built doesn't feel like yours anymore. And that's exactly what this house was. Mine. Or at least, it started that way. 42 years ago, there was nothing here but dirt and weeds. I remember the first day I stood on this land with a folded blueprint in my hand and sweat running down my back. Back then I was 31, young enough to believe that if you worked hard enough, life would reward you. And maybe it did. Just not in the way I expected. My wife and I didn't come from money. We came from long days and tired bones. Factory shifts, overtime, weekends spent fixing things instead of resting. The kind of life where you measure success not by luxury, but by stability. A roof that doesn't leak. Bills paid on time. Food on the table. And the hope that your children might live a little easier than you did. When my son was born, I made a promise to myself. He would never have to struggle the way we did. I still remember the first time I held him. Tiny fists. Red face. Screaming like the world had offended him already. My wife laughed and said, "He's going to be stubborn." I smiled. "Good," I said. "That means he'll survive." Back then, everything felt simple. Work hard. Raise your kid right. Build something that lasts. For years, that's exactly what we did. I worked construction during the day and picked up maintenance jobs at night. My wife managed the house like a general, running a small army. We saved every extra dollar. Skipped vacations. Drove the same old car until the engine sounded like it was coughing up gravel. Piece by piece, life improved. The house grew. First a small addition, then a bigger kitchen, eventually a second floor. Every wall held a memory. The scratch on the hallway floor from when my son rode his bike inside after I told him not to. The pencil marks on the doorframe, measuring his height year after year. The dent in the garage wall from the time he tried to throw a baseball, like the pros. I fixed the wall, but I left the dent. Some things are worth remembering. As he grew older, I tried to teach him the things my father taught me. Respect. Responsibility. Gratitude. Simple words. Hard lessons. When he was 12, I started bringing him to job sites on weekends. He hated it at first. Too early. Too dusty. Too boring. But I told him something my father once told me. Work teaches you the value of things. He rolled his eyes the first time I said it. But he came anyway. Sometimes he carried tools. Sometimes he just watched. Sometimes he complained. But slowly, he started to understand. At least I thought he did. Years passed the way they always do. Quietly. Graduation. First job. First car. Then one day, he walked into the house with a woman beside him. "This is Karen," he said. Karen smiled. Bright smile. Confident posture. Sharp eyes that scanned the room in seconds. She looked around the house, the way someone might look at a hotel lobby. Evaluating. Measuring. Calculating. But I didn't notice that back then. Or maybe I noticed and ignored it. Parents are good at ignoring things that might complicate happiness. At first, everything seemed fine. Karen was polite, respectful even. She called me sir, asked about the history of the house, listened when I talked about the years it took to build it. My son looked proud standing next to her, like he had chosen someone impressive. And maybe he had. But impressions can be misleading. When they got engaged, I helped them plan the wedding. Paid for half of it. Not because they asked. Because I wanted to. My wife used to say that weddings weren't just about two people. They were about families becoming something new. She passed away 3 years before the wedding. Cancer. Vast. Cruel. Silent. One day, we were talking about planting tomatoes in the garden. 6 months later, I was standing beside a hospital bed, listening to machines that sounded like clocks counting down. Losing her changed the house. It changed everything. Rooms that used to feel warm suddenly felt too large. Too quiet. But when my son got engaged, I thought maybe life was starting to move again. Maybe this house would feel alive again. After the wedding, they moved in. That was the plan we all agreed on. The house was big enough. And I was getting older. Or at least that's what everyone said. At first it worked. Shared dinners. Weekend barbecues. Laughter in the living room again. But slowly, something shifted. Not loudly. Quietly. Karen began making small changes. New furniture. Different curtains. Kitchen reorganized. None of it was wrong. But each change felt like a small step away from the life that used to exist here. The first time she corrected me, it sounded harmless. "We don't really do things that way anymore," she said. I remember pausing. "Wait." She laughed lightly. "You know what I mean." Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. But after that, the words started appearing more often. "We decided. We think. We prefer." And somewhere inside those sentences, my place in the house started shrinking. At first, it was small things. My chair in the living room moved to the corner. My tools reorganized in the garage without asking. Then it grew into bigger things. Finances. House decisions. Renovation plans. Karen had opinions about everything. Strong ones. My son listened. More than he used to listen to me. And that's when I started noticing something else. She didn't just disagree with me. She dismissed me. Little comments. Half jokes. Times have changed. That's not how things work anymore. You're being old-fashioned. At first, I let it go. Because families require patience. Because arguments solve nothing. Because my son looked tired whenever tension appeared. But patience has limits. And respect is one of them. The first time she said something openly disrespectful happened during dinner. We were discussing selling a piece of land behind the house. I suggested holding on to it. Land increases in value over time. Karen shook her head immediately. "That's outdated thinking," she said. I looked at my son. "What do you think?" He hesitated. Karen answered before he could. "We've already talked about it." "Wait." Again. Then she said something that made the table go quiet. "With all due respect, you're not really involved in these kinds of decisions anymore." My son shifted in his chair. I waited for him to say something. He didn't. That silence spoke louder than anything else. Still, even then, I didn't imagine things would reach the point they eventually did. Because there's a difference between disagreement and humiliation. And the day she crossed that line came faster than I expected. It started with a conversation about paperwork. Karen had been making a lot of calls lately. Talking about property values. Loans. Investment opportunities. Things that seemed oddly urgent. One afternoon, she walked into the living room holding a stack of papers. "We need to organize some documents," she said. Need. Another interesting word. "What documents?" I asked. "Ownership records, financial statements, signatures." Something about the way she said that word lingered in the air. Signatures. But before I could ask more, she sighed and looked at me the way someone looks at a broken appliance. And that's when she said it. "Honestly, I don't even know why you still try to involve yourself in things. You're old and useless." The words didn't echo. They just sat there. Heavy. Ugly. Permanent. My son said nothing. Not a single word. That silence told me something I didn't want to admit. Respect doesn't disappear overnight. It fades. Until one day, someone finally says out loud what they've been thinking for a long time. I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. I just set my coffee down and walked out of the room. Some people think strength is loud. But sometimes strength is simply refusing to break in front of people who expect you to. That night, I sat in the garage longer than usual. The smell of old wood and engine oil felt familiar. Safe. This was the one place in the house that still felt like mine. My tools were still exactly where I left them. Order. Logic. No politics. No disrespect. Just quiet work. But even in the garage, something about that conversation stayed in my mind. Not the insult. I've lived long enough to know insults say more about the person speaking them than the person receiving them. No. What stayed in my mind was something else. Why had Karen suddenly become so interested in documents? Ownership. Financial records. Signatures. Those weren't casual topics. They were legal ones. And Karen was many things. But careless wasn't one of them. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things. Conversations stopping when I entered the room. Phone calls taken outside. Documents spread across the dining table late at night. Karen's tone toward me didn't improve. If anything, it became colder. More impatient. But mixed inside, that impatience was something new. Urgency. As if time suddenly mattered. As if something needed to happen soon. And then one evening, something happened that changed everything. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just walking past the hallway when I heard Karen's voice. Sharp. Frustrated. "Without his signature, it won't go through," she said. I stopped. My son spoke quietly. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she replied. "The documents are clear." Silence followed. Then Karen said something that made my chest tighten. "We just need to convince him." Convince him. My son asked the question I was already thinking. "And if he refuses?" Karen's answer came immediately. "He won't." Another pause. Then she added quietly, "He doesn't even realize how much power he actually has." I stood in that hallway for a long time after their voices faded. Because suddenly, the insult from earlier sounded different. Old. Useless. Except apparently, not useless enough to remove from a legal document. Not useless enough to replace. Not useless enough to ignore. And that's when the story truly began to change. Because sometimes the person people underestimate the most is the person holding the one thing they need most. The next morning, the house felt different. Not louder. Not quieter. Just careful. People think tension always looks dramatic. Raised voices, slamming doors, angry words. But the most dangerous kind of tension is polite. That was the kind waiting for me at the breakfast table. Karen was already there when I walked in. She had coffee ready, toast on a plate, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said. Her tone was warm. Too warm. For months she had spoken to me like someone speaks to a malfunctioning machine. Short sentences, thin patience. Now suddenly, there was softness in her voice. Respect. Or at least something pretending to be respect. My son sat beside her, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added sugar. He looked up. "Morning, Dad." I nodded and sat down. No one spoke for a few seconds. Karen slid the plate of toast toward me. "Thought you might be hungry." I looked at the plate, then at her, then back at the plate. Funny how small things suddenly feel suspicious. Toast had never required strategy before. "Thank you," I said. We ate in silence for another minute before Karen cleared her throat. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about." Wanted. Another carefully chosen word. I didn't answer. Just waited. Karen folded her hands neatly on the table, like someone about to present a business proposal. "We're working on an opportunity," she said. "A really good one." My son nodded slightly, but didn't speak. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked. "A property development deal," she replied quickly. "Investment partners, expansion potential, it's very promising." Her words came smoothly. Too smoothly. She had rehearsed this. "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked. Karen glanced briefly at my son before answering. "Well," she said carefully, "because of how the house and land are legally structured, some documents require your authorization." Authorization. Interesting choice again. Not help. Not support. Authorization. "And what documents are those?" I asked. Karen reached into a folder beside her and pulled out several papers. Contracts. Legal forms. Bank agreements. She slid them across the table. "All standard paperwork," she said lightly. I didn't touch them yet. Instead, I looked at my son. "Have you read these?" He hesitated. Karen answered before he could. "Of course we have. We. Always we." I finally picked up the top page. Years ago, during one of the worst property disputes I ever witnessed in my own extended family, I made a decision. I never put everything in someone else's name. Even my son's. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I understood something about life that younger people rarely believe. Circumstances change. People change. Pressure changes people the most. So when I built this house and purchased the surrounding land, I structured the ownership carefully. Lawyers. Contracts. Safeguards. The house legally required my approval for any major financial restructuring. My son knew that. Karen apparently had just discovered it. I scanned the document slowly. Loan agreement. Property collateral. Equity restructuring. And then the numbers appeared. Large numbers. Risky numbers. Numbers that could either multiply their wealth or destroy everything. I set the papers down. "How much debt are you taking on?" I asked. Karen answered immediately. "It's not debt," she said quickly. "It's leverage." That answer told me everything. Because people who rename debt usually have too much of it. I looked at the contract again. "It says here the house becomes collateral," I said calmly. Karen smiled. "Technically, yes. Technically." Another favorite word of people who avoid consequences. My son shifted in his chair. "It's temporary," he said quietly. I looked at him. "For how long?" Karen answered again. "Just until the project stabilizes." "And if it does?" Silence. Karen leaned forward slightly. "It will," she said confidently. Confidence. Another interesting currency. Often borrowed. Rarely owned. I tapped the document. "You're asking me to risk the house." Karen's smile tightened. It's not a risk, she insisted. It's an investment. I leaned back in my chair. Funny, I said. What is? She asked. For someone who thinks I'm old and useless, I replied calmly. You seem to need my signature quite badly. The room went still. Corinne's expression froze for half a second before she recovered. I didn't mean that the way it sounded, she said quickly. Of course not. People rarely mean the truth when they say it out loud. My son cleared his throat. Dad, it's a good opportunity. Is it? I asked. He nodded slowly. Corinne jumped in again. The return projections are enormous. Projections, I repeated. Yes. I looked at her. You ever seen a projection survive reality? She didn't answer that. Instead, she changed tactics. Look, she said gently, we're trying to grow something here, build a future. I almost laughed. Build a future. Interesting phrase to use when standing inside a house someone else already built. I turned another page. Who are your partners? I asked. Corinne hesitated. That was the first honest moment of the entire conversation. Investors, she said vaguely. Names weren't listed. That bothered me. Real partnerships have names. Anonymous partnerships have problems. How much of your own money are you putting in? I asked. Corinne's tone cooled slightly. That's not really the point. No, I said calmly. It's exactly the point. My son rubbed his forehead. Dad. But I raised my hand gently. Let her answer. Corinne inhaled slowly. We're contributing time, management, and strategy. Translation. Not much cash, but plenty of ambition. I leaned forward and folded the documents closed. Let me explain something, I said quietly. Corinne watched me carefully. My son looked nervous. I spent 40 years building stability, I continued, not chasing shortcuts. Corinne forced a smile. This isn't a shortcut. Then why does it need my house as insurance? Silence again. Corinne tried another approach. Soft voice. Slight tilt of the head. We're family, she said. Family. Strange how that word appears most often when money enters the room. You didn't seem to feel that way yesterday, I said calmly. Corinne's smile disappeared. People say things in frustration, she replied. Yes, I said. They do. Another pause stretched between us. Then she changed tactics again. Guilt. Don't you want your son to succeed? That question landed heavier than the others, because it carried emotional weight. But emotional weight doesn't change mathematics. I do, I said quietly. Then help him. I looked directly at my son. Is this your dream? I asked. He hesitated. Corinne answered immediately. It's our plan. But I wasn't asking her. I was asking him. My son finally spoke. I think it could work. Could. Another interesting word. Not will. Could. Do you understand what happens if it does? I asked. He didn't answer. Corinne did. You're exaggerating the risk. No, I said. I'm calculating it. And that's when the mask finally started slipping. Corinne's patience began thinning. You're being overly cautious, she said. I nodded slowly. Yes. That's how people keep houses. Her jaw tightened. You're standing in the way of progress. I looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. Every cabinet installed by me. Every tile laid by me. Progress. Interesting word. Often used by people standing on someone else's foundation. I'm standing in the way of losing this house, I said quietly. Corinne leaned back in her chair. So that's it, she said. You're refusing to support your own family. I didn't answer immediately. Because I wasn't refusing anything yet. I was thinking, and thinking takes time. Eventually, I stood up. I'll review the documents, I said. Karen looked frustrated. We need an answer soon. I'm aware. When? When I finish reading them. And with that, I carried the papers into the living room. That afternoon, I read every page. Twice. And the more I read, the clearer the picture became. Karen's opportunity wasn't just ambitious. It was dangerous. High-interest financing. Aggressive expansion timelines. Partners who had contributed very little capital themselves. And most importantly, the house. This house was the primary collateral. If the project failed, the bank wouldn't negotiate. They would take the house. 40 years. Gone. For a gamble. By evening, I understood something very clearly. This wasn't about opportunity. It was about greed. But what surprised me most wasn't Karen. Ambition had always burned brightly in her. No. What surprised me was my son. Because somewhere between childhood and adulthood, he had started believing confidence was the same thing as wisdom. That night we sat down again. Karen was visibly impatient. So, she asked, have you decided? I placed the documents on the table. I have. My son looked nervous. Karen looked determined. And I looked at both of them carefully. Before I answer, I said, there are some things you need to understand. Karen crossed her arms. We already understand the situation. No, I replied calmly. You understand the opportunity. But you don't understand the risk. She rolled her eyes slightly. Here we go. I ignored the comment. I've seen deals like this before, I continued. Many times. Karen smirked. With respect, the market is different now. Markets change. Human nature does not. Confidence doesn't remove risk, I said. It hides it. Karen leaned forward sharply. So you're saying no? No, I said calmly. I'm saying I won't sign these documents. My son inhaled slowly. Karen's expression hardened immediately. That's incredibly selfish, she snapped. I didn't react. She continued. You're sabotaging our future because you're afraid. Afraid. Interesting accusation. Fear protects people from losing everything, I said quietly. Karen stood up abruptly. This is unbelievable. My son looked torn. Dad. I turned toward him. You deserve better than a gamble disguised as a plan. Karen laughed bitterly. Unbelievable. You call me reckless, but you're the one holding your son back. I shook my head slowly. No. I'm protecting the house he grew up in. She stared at me with anger. You're doing this out of pride. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to. But pride wasn't what I felt. What I felt was something quieter. Responsibility. The same responsibility I felt the day I held my son for the first time. The same responsibility that built these walls. Karen grabbed the folder. Fine, she said coldly. Don't sign it. Her voice dropped slightly. But remember something. What's that? I asked. You're the reason this opportunity dies. I met her gaze calmly. No, I said. It dies because it was too dangerous to begin with. She stormed out of the room. My son stayed behind. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, You really think it would fail? I looked at him. I think the risk was too high. He nodded slowly. Not fully convinced. But thinking. And sometimes thinking is the first step toward wisdom. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, I realized something important. Power isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. Real power is quiet. It sits in your hand when you sign a document. Or when you refused to. Karen had called me old. She had called me useless. But tonight something had changed. Because the future of that deal, the future of this house, and perhaps even the future of our family, had all been decided by the one voice she thought didn't matter. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that determines everything.